Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Simon Marshall. I'm going to be your host for this afternoon's Insights seminar. We've got a tremendous panel of speakers joining us this afternoon. So I will do my very best to not talk too much so we can get to those colleagues that are going to take us through the topics. Just very quickly wanted to give you a bit of housekeeping for those of you that may not have joined us at an Insights event before. Can I just remind colleagues that we are recording the event. We'll be sending out a link with the recording and copies of slides after the event, so there's no need to necessarily try and capture everything that's being said, and hopefully that'll give you the opportunity to engage more in the conversation. Can I ask you if you could kindly leave your camera on, so particularly when we're speaking we can see reaction, but can I ask if you can kindly keep your microphone off so we can keep noise to the minimum and make sure that the recording is as good as it can be. Obviously, being on Teams, please can I encourage you as we go to use the chat function. Please do ask questions or comment as we go. We'll be returning to use the chat for some of our question and answer session after we've heard from some of our speakers. And obviously, there will also be an opportunity if there are any questions that we are unable to cover during the time we have to us this afternoon. We will endeavour to try and talk to our speakers and come back with answers after the event. So, as I mentioned, we've got quite an esteemed catalogue of speakers this afternoon. I'll be saying a little bit more about colleagues in a moment, and we'll be introducing as we go. But as you can see, we've deliberately gone for quite a wide and diverse range of speakers today, and we hope that's going to really bring to life what I think is a really exciting topic, and I suspect and hope we're going to be able to explore much more in the chat. Thanks very much, Katie. If we could stop sharing the slides now. Thank you. Well, so good afternoon, everybody. My name's Simon Marshall. I'm Deputy Director for Rehabilitation and Care Services and HM Prison and Probation Service. That effectively means I have responsibility for a range of issues for faith, for families, health and social care, industries, catering, farms and gardens, third sector, and sustainability. And you'll see that I think there's a number of themes in there that will come out in the course of this afternoon. One of the other hats that I also have that I should declare up front is I'm also the chair of the Arts in the Criminal Justice Forum, which brings together colleagues looking at how we can use the creative industries more within prison settings. And I'm also currently the chair of the Academy for Social Justice. And we've hosted a number of events together with the Insights team and delighted to continue to do so. There's not many occasions, I think, as a host, you can say you've genuinely waited almost 20 years for a seminar to take place. But in 1995, I was sat as a prospective postgrad student. I'd just done 1 year in the School of Geography at the University of Birmingham. And I was asked to give a presentation to try and convince colleagues that my topic was worthy of jumping from a master's to do my PhD. So I gave a presentation on comparing different rehabilitative environments. And as part of that, I used a series of images that were trying to contrast some very austere concrete images with concrete structures with lots of bars on it, very austere, and some settings that had access to a lot of green space, open air, and gardens. Of course, the irony was that the concrete and austere setting was actually taken around the University of Birmingham and was largely in the building I was sat in at the time. And in fact, the scenes of the gardens were taken from a recent visit I'd had to HMP Hewell Grange. If anyone had the opportunity to visit the Grange while it was open, you'll know it has quite a stunning set of gardens. And it was really trying to demonstrate that actually we can't make too many assumptions about environments, but we can also really understand the importance that positive environments can make in terms of the way we can produce outcomes. So we've known for a long time about this relationship between people and spaces, and it's at the heart of a great deal of different literature across different settings, some of which we'll hear about this afternoon, that can produce successful outcomes. So if we look, for example, at some of the leadership and management training, they talk a lot about conditions for success, which you'll have noted we have in the title of the seminar today. And they focus very heavily on the relationship between the settings in which delivery takes place, but also critically the relationships between staff and how that contributes to outcomes. Similarly, if we look at a lot of the health literature, there's a body of evidence around healing environments, and that obviously takes in a range of activity. We know that there is evidence about better recovery when people have access to or can see green spaces in the natural environment. So anything that can make environments less sterile can have an impact. But also, again, coming back to my arts hat, and I think we'll probably hear a bit more from one of our speakers a bit later on as well. Both the Tate and the King's Fund have also cited evidence around growing bodies of research that show access to arts can reduce stress for people that are recovering in hospital. It can reduce the need for analgesics and has actually been found to speed recovery. Again, if we look at the business and education sector, they talk a lot about conducive environments and how to make conducive environments for learning, for business. And again, common to those is evidence around how the right environment can reduce stress, can improve well-being, can produce better outcomes, and critically for staff and for pupils or customers. The Royal College of Psychiatrists have developed their Enabling Environments programme, which again focuses very much on how settings can improve outcomes in schools, across health settings, and in course we've been working with them under the Offender Personality Disorder programme to work in custody. What all of these literature highlight is that there is a growing evidence of how you can improve outcomes for people who critically work and live in a particular setting by considering the relationship both between people in those settings and their relationship with that environment in which they operate. With that awareness, of course, comes a greater understanding also potentially some of the negative impacts that we can have on that environment. And so particularly if we think about the contribution to waste, resource consumption, and therefore that points us to the need to really consider and focus on how sustainable our approaches are and our relationship with our environments. So today we really want to take the opportunity to explore this growing evidence and how we can create environments that improve outcomes for those working in settings in the criminal justice system, with a particular focus on prisons. We hope that this is going to create a really exciting opportunity to share and learn from the range of colleagues that we will be hearing from today, from evidence, from practice, and as when we come on to the session after we've heard from our speakers, there'll be an opportunity to really, again, share and hear from you who've joined us this afternoon about some of your experiences. But what we're particularly keen to do is really focus on some of the practical takeaways that we can offer you. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our first speaker. I'm sure Alison probably doesn't remember, but one of my first ports of call after I finished at University of Birmingham was actually applied for a fellowship to work with Alison at Cambridge. Fortunately, probably or unfortunately, depending on which way you look at it, I wasn't successful in securing the funding. I think I was rather helpfully told I was the second runner-up in terms of achieving the funding, but it did prompt me to continue to follow with great excitement and passion the work that Alison has done. Anyone that works across criminal justice can't fail to have read Alison's many pieces over many, many years on safety, on well-being, and her prison officer book continues to be kind of the manual that we see most colleagues clasping as they finish their induction to really understand what life is going to really be like. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Professor Alison Liebling.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm just going to see if I know how to share my screen. Yeah. Does that work?
Yep.
Is that okay as it is?
If you can put it into slide mode, it might be slightly bigger. Yeah. There we go. Perfect. Thank you, Alison.
Okay. So thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the organisers for this invitation to talk with such a well-informed audience about my ongoing work. I'm writing a book, synthesising and trying to make sense of all I've learned about prison environments over the last 30 years. And I'm drawing on my research on suicide, my recent work with others in the high security estate, particularly in Whitemoor, Full Sutton and Frankland, and on a project I finished with colleagues on shared reading in prison pipes. But in a way, the prisons don't matter. They've all changed since we did the fieldwork. The purpose of this exercise is to identify general patterns and explanations, to push differences to their limits, and to answer two specific and two more enduring questions. So the specific questions are, why do some prisons create distress, anger and violence, whereas others, however rarely, create hope and meaningful change? And what's the role of prison staff in these dynamics? And then the more enduring questions are, what's going on in places where the best work and the best prisoner experiences are found? And what's the meaning in practice of the term humanity? I'm returning to that because the term is still in the prison service statement of purpose, and yet it still cries out for closer examination. So I'm thinking with pre-COVID data, but I'm confident that the findings are relevant to the post-COVID world that you are all about to build. And one of the reasons I'm confident about this is because what I found resonates with more general theorizing about what destroys or builds human beings more generally. So we're built or destroyed by other human beings. And I'm finally starting to understand how this works, or at least my aim is to have understood and articulated this to the best of my ability by the time I finished writing the book. So my argument, built from data and existing theory, is that human beings vibrate, that we're sensitive to feedback we receive from others. And this feedback can range from fellow feeling, the sympathetic reverberations of another soul to our experience, as George Eliot put it, through indifference, we do not matter, to hostility, being degraded or treated as non-human. And I've been interested in what humanity as well as inhumanity look and feel like for a very long time. Prisons are, I argue elsewhere, good places for working that out, partly because they differ so significantly, partly because they're closed and controlled environments in which difficult things can be measured, and partly because, contrary to what many people assume, prisoners and prison staff are extremely good with words. They describe their own experience much more concisely and meaningfully than many philosophers do. So, by way of background, some important findings I'm building on include the following: that some prisons are more survivable than others. So we know that suicides are not randomly distributed, but they cluster in prisons with poor moral climates. Lack of safety is especially relevant here, but this is described by prisoners as characterised by unresponsive and unapproachable staff. Talk, attentiveness, activity and help, including from specialists, reduce distress and therefore suicide. The current distress among prisoners is highly correlated with suicide rates in individual establishments. So measuring something intermediate like distress, then trying to explain and reduce it, is often more informative and effective than trying to predict suicides. And this methodological step away from the relatively rare outcome, suicide, and its substitution by something more frequent and relevant like distress, may work with other outcomes, as I'll show. Research in other countries using our moral climates framework has shown that poor moral climates are associated with higher risks of violence. And the concept of moral climate includes respect and relationships, but also safety, policing, and good staff uses of authority. And these values are often in tension. So prisons find it quite hard to hold them all together in a workable place. So moral dualism is challenging. Relationships are misunderstood if they're seen as softening prison life. So right staff-prisoner relationships allow power to flow, information to be exchanged, and dynamic security to be built. Prison staff don't maintain order in prison, they create it by building knowledge of individuals over time, using authority carefully and professionally, and setting the grooves for reasonable behaviour. And this is skilled work. Finally, an analysis of MQPL scores in all prisons over 5 years found a significant relationship between high scores on moral quality dimensions and better reconviction outcomes. And treatment is not the key variable in accomplishing change, but high engagement in good programs delivered in a legitimate climate can be. So sometimes, in line with decades of work in psychiatry, the environment can be the doctor. This means the material, social, interpersonal, organisational and emotional conditions in a unit or prison or wing and their interactions. So in other words, it looks like our long-term attempt to conceptualise and measure moral climates has paid off, in the sense that it's provided some reasonably persuasive evidence that poor climates lead to a range of bad outcomes, whereas better climates lead to a range of better outcomes. And mostly, even though they're in tension, our indicators of moral climate, a sort of set of conceptual empirical dimensions, act in linear ways, so the higher the score, the better. But this is more complicated with the dimensions I've been pursuing more recently, particularly anger and trust. So let me summarise what we found on anger, as well as how we came to be studying it, before I move on to describe what we've seen in the best environments. So, creating anger. Some of you will know that I was invited to carry out a repeat study of Whitemoor Prison in 2009 to 10, 12 years after I'd conducted an early study of the work of prison officers. The original study, the prison officer study, remains one of the most satisfying I ever did, and largely because the prison was in a very good place professionally, and we were able to watch prison officers carrying out sophisticated work, creating peace and stability via the skilled use of discretion, grounded in close knowledge of prisoners, in a range of ways on different wings. As Simon mentioned, that work became the prison officer. But 12 years later, much had changed, including sentencing and prisoner demographics, and also the organisation of knowledge in prisons. So this time, officers were more distant from prisoners, less comfortable with a much more diverse and challenging population, and expertise about these new risk subjects was held in security information reports and psychological assessments, rather than on the wing by experienced staff. And this created some dangers. Prisoners were more tense and angry than they'd been before, and some were systematically pushing staff back by creating the new no-go area of faith practices. This was one of the few areas of prison life where prisoners could find power and agency. Many of you will remember that life-affirming and creative activities like comedy clubs and theatre were no longer politically acceptable. I'm hopeful, actually, that these activities seem to be making a comeback. For all sorts of reasons, including the Feltham murder of a prisoner by his racist cellmate, legitimate anxieties about discrimination turned into fear of intervention among staff and managers. All sorts of new power vacuums arose. There was also what we called a distrust paralysis. We hadn't understood how much intelligent trust had been present in the Whitemoor study 1 until we felt its absence in the second study. So as a result of these complex and troubling dynamics, a team of us set out to study the location and building of trust in high security prisons, and we developed several new dimensions for this purpose. One of them was called political charge, defined as anger, alienation and reactivity. And my hypothesis, based on the second Whitemoor study, was that political charge might work in relation to the risk of radicalisation, a bit like distress worked for suicide. So in other words, if we measured something grounded and real, anger, then we might be able to unpick the dynamics of extremist violence in prison better than had been managed so far, as well as develop a more informative account of what was going on more generally in high security prisons. And what we found was powerful. I've shifted somewhat away from political charge and more towards anger in general, that is, feelings of upset, indignation, frustration and hostility, as I've started to write about this. And what's important about anger is that it carries action potential. So violence of all kinds is latent in it. And there are disturbed as well as apt varieties of anger. So in the draft chapter I've written, I've tried to describe its phenomenology in detail, drawing especially on fieldwork notes as well as survey data. One of the things that's missed about anger is that it can be a very valuable source of information. So why are prisoners so angry? What precisely are they angry about? And most of the drivers of anger were related to injustice, disregard, slights, powerlessness, and bureaucratic illegitimacy or sentences that were impossible to navigate. Other drivers are in the complex dispositions of prisoners, many of whom have disturbances and fragilities of the self that make relationships with other people volatile. So as in our analysis of distress, we found most of the explanation for variations in anger in aspects of the climate as measured in the MQPL survey. So you can see the dimensions that contribute were bureaucratic legitimacy, humanity, staff-prisoner relationships, respect, decency, intelligent trust, and staff professionalism. These dimensions reflect a kind of bureaucratic and personal disregard, a sense of feeling like an object of power. And as in our analysis of distress, individual characteristics explained very little, not that we measured individual dispositions in much detail. So what was clear from this research was not only that levels of anger were significantly different in the two prisons we studied, but these different emotional climates gave rise to very different relationships with faith and identity among prisoners. So prisoners in the angrier prison pushed for religious recognition, mobilized into narrow and oppositional groups, and coerced others into their cause. Their anger was not essentially political, but in an age of identity politics, there were ready frameworks into which anger could be channeled. In the less angry prison, faith was explored in more open and nuanced ways. Prisoners shared religious doubts, asked each other questions, and felt at ease with complex identities. The language I'm starting to use to describe the kinds of identities that were being formed in the angry prison is the alienated self. This was an I-it universe. Prisoners felt treated as experienced objects. They felt locked into defiance. Power seekers climbed to the top of the social hierarchy, enforcing oppositional norms. Measuring levels of anger gives us a kind of heat map. So scorching heat makes fires more likely. And we did find there was more violence, including incidents that looked like extremist violence in the angry prison. So to the less angry prison, here something very different was going on. And this is what I'm excitedly writing about at the moment. I'm only touching on this briefly, but I think there's something fundamental emerging here. So I've called this section Creating Personhood. Kirk Turner, who's here, talked about the yellow epiphany when I showed our results from Franklin several years ago now. Here's the yellow epiphany. We found these very high scores in few places, just means everything scores above 3. But we're beginning now to explore the empirical relationships between these kinds of scores and outcomes. There's less violence, including, we think, extremist inclinations in these climates. But it makes more sense to think about violence in general, including suicide. So all bad outcomes seem to cluster together. Prisoner hierarchies were less steep and much less oppositional. Individual prisoners were less caught up or locked into conflict. Instead, they were invested in building a peaceful coexistence. So on the pipe, which was both exceptional and yet representative of a clear and concentrated version of the best aspects of the prison in general, prisoners said things like, "You become yourself. This unit has allowed me to be myself. This is the best place I've ever been. They front you, talk to you, help you. They see me as a person, see me suffering. It's connection." So the pipe had what we might call a vow intentionality. Prisoners were experiencing subjects. They were seen as whole, complex and emergent, or embodying potential. Setbacks were digested and learned from. Staff stayed in the struggle for longer, trying to coax out the better person. There was a detectable moral professional framework present in the prison. It was actively deliberative. So the prison as a whole felt relatively clear, boundaried and intelligent. A lot of careful thinking went on. It was not ideal, there were some problems. So for now, I'm just trying to capture the essence of what we observed when practice was at its best. It wasn't that violence was absent, it was being constantly worked on. Prisoners talked movingly about how underlying their violence, there were powerful and turbulent emotions they needed help to unpick, understand and control. Aggression is not just physical, it's what you become. I'm undoing that bit by bit. It's like learning to ride a bike. Many started out with no idea of how they came across to others, so they needed carefully communicated, helpful, and often professionally well-informed feedback. This helped them to grow as agents, to develop authority over themselves, and to connect new habits to character formation. Not all of what went on was expert. Ordinary kindness was not forbidden. We battered them with kindness. We bantered with him till we got through, wore him down till he moved off Cat A. Or X is the best officer ever. He doesn't bullshit. He's straight down the line. You really have to take a good look at yourself in here. And it's treatment and discipline together. I wrote in my fieldwork notes, staff really get it. They use their old traditional skills as well as their new psychological ones. It's important to note that this disposition among staff was present elsewhere in the prison, in officers, workshop instructors, PE staff, educators, and so on. We've also seen it in other prisons. Prisoners felt significantly more recognised as the person I am in this prison, but this was not appeasement and could include the acknowledgement of real risks. The point is how people were treated impacted on what they did, both individually and socially, and what they became on the development and expression of their personhood. I went on angry, came out calm. The point is that decent interpersonal treatment is not just about feeling good, it shapes who we become. I'm starting to theorise from the qualitative data about why these better outcomes might be the case, and the trail I'm on at the moment, despite the fact that I find the language awkward, is Philip Pettit's notion of the personated self. This is the contrast to the alienated self. It's a self managing to travel along its natural trajectory, finding its way to an ethical life. We all do this, but we need help to do it, and the help we need is other people. The personated self is not power craving or self-deceiving, but forms moral habits which develop sound character. This self can summon all its natural capacities and point them in a positive direction. When this process is thwarted, our natural capacities become charged in a negative direction. I've said before that in Frankland, especially, but not exclusively in the Pipe, we saw what I now call I-thou relations, prisoners being treated as whole persons with complex inner lives, experiencing subjects rather than experienced objects. What I hadn't thought about until I read my way to the right literature is the I, or the self, in this relationship. So to be treated as a thou, you have to become an I. And that's what's going on in good prison environments. So remember I said at the beginning that human beings vibrate. It's our minds that vibrate. Our consciousness is sophisticated. We read others' minds or intentions as signals. We infer things. We think about what we perceive. This is an innate capacity, and it lies at the heart of our survival and flourishing. So Philip Pettit argues that the human mind speaks. It functions in a dense field of others. The invention of language, he argues, transformed our innate capacities to communicate, so we start to live immersed in a sea of felt as well as spoken expectations and intentions. Along came commitments and responsibility, natural orientations towards an inbuilt ideal or ethical life that can only take place in relationships with others. In other words, norms arise around the fact that we interact. We become ethical when we're helped to organise our own impulses into a form of well-functioning agency. So in other words, we become better people if we are helped in our kind of deliberations and thinking and reflection about that process. We regulate and author our own minds. Others help us to do that. So we learn to become reliable, unified, sincere, less fragmented, and only then can we make commitments and enter into moral relations with others or become trustworthy. We can't become proper people, personated in Pettit's language, without norms. So this is what we saw going on in the Pipe environment. Pettit argues, for example, that respect means treating people as conversible agents. It's a natural human capacity to speak and to represent our own experience, something known in the literature as first-person authority. When we're treated as experienced objects, this capacity is ignored. When we're treated as experiencing subjects, someone is acknowledging our capacity to speak for ourselves. The problem is this capacity has to be worked at. And when experience goes wrong in our early lives, the capacity to represent our experience may be damaged. We need to be treated as a thou before we can come an I. So the prisoner who said, "This is the best place I've ever been," they front you, talk to you, help you, put his finger on the button. By being treated as a person, he became better at being a person. And much of this work goes on in ordinary but skilled interaction. We found something very similar in our evaluation of shared reading in prison pipes. Because of the conditions in shared reading environments, they share qualities with the conditions of best pipes, and participants' scores on our new dimensions, being myself and developing agency, increased over time. So we coordinate ourselves as we make sense of our experience and of others via holding and creative experiencing. So to conclude, we are conversible vibrating humans, or speaking vibrating humans. When we're treated as anything less, we struggle, resist and suffer. The dispositions of staff in Frankland were very different from the dispositions of staff in the Angria prison. Paradoxically, their professional confidence or trust in themselves enabled them to doubt their own judgment, so that they asked questions, looked for further evidence, and developed a nuanced, grounded and psychologically informed understanding of prisoners. Staff in the Angry prison were both more distant and more certain. So this is less about trust than about doubt. I don't have time to talk about the important distinction between intelligent trust and blind faith, but staff in the best prison environments are fully present in an engaged and meaningful way, and so they make their guarded trust decisions wisely. The kind of presence I'm talking about is a sort of co-presence. We bring another into being by connecting to what's alive in them. So this analysis begins to address my enduring question about the meaning of the term humanity. Our proper motive for treating people as conversible agents, Pettit argues, is not about avoiding negative consequences, but it's about the conversibility of humans. In other words, this is what it means to be human. We speak. If it's a human capacity to speak, we must be treated as conversible. So this requirement is grounded in our humanness. So to conclude, good moral climates are intentional. They support growth. Everyone in them knows what matters. Staff expertise and presence is one of the keys to better and less damaging prison environments. So prison staff constitute as well as create the environment. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you ever so much, Alison. It's absolutely fascinating, and already I can see a number of questions coming in. I think, as you say, the fact that often people think of environments as being distinct from the people that create them and populate them is probably one of the areas that the consistency around the literature across those different settings I talked about highlights, that this is about the interaction between people and their setting, not just the setting by itself. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions when we come on to it, but thank you again for that really fantastic opening. I'd like to now hand on to Professor Dominic Moran. I've had great experience of meeting Professor Moran on a number of occasions. Probably most recently, we spoke when she was doing some work at Home House Prison, where I was providing some kind of insights. Again, has got a fantastic body of literature that contributes to our understanding of work in prisons, has done a lot of work around families and visiting, which I believe she's going to touch on, but also particularly most recently has been done some fantastic work around relationships and outcomes. So I won't say anything more. I'll just hand over to Professor Moran. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. I hope everyone can see my slide. I hope I've been able to share that correctly.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be able to follow on from Alison's talk. I agree with all the things that she's saying, and I think those interactions are extremely important. And I guess what I'm thinking about this afternoon is the spaces in which those interactions might take place. And I come at this, unlike Alison, I'm not a criminologist by training, I'm a human geographer by training, but I happen to be interested in the spaces in which we confine people. But from my human geography training, you know, I know, as we all do, that spaces matter. And I suppose we all understand this in our everyday lives, in the way that we're aware that certain spaces are shaping our behaviour, encouraging us towards certain things. We know, for example, that the supermarkets are designed and they smell in particular ways to encourage us to buy certain things. When we could all go to airports and so on, we understood the kind of work that was being done to us to encourage us to buy things and eat and drink and shop in departure lounges in which we might otherwise be quite stressed, especially if we're scared of flying. And in the post 9/11 world, we've become accustomed to walking around in urban spaces which are highly secure without necessarily appearing securitized. So these two things in the pictures that you can see there, those are hostile vehicle mitigation measures. They are there to stop very large vehicles being driven at speed into those buildings, but they look like just a piece of urban furniture that we wouldn't particularly perhaps connect with that sort of terrorist threat. So I think we understand at a range of levels the ways in which spaces matter. But spaces matter in prisons too, and I think they matter especially in these environments, particularly where these are places that those, especially who are incarcerated in them, can't get away from. Quite clearly, they can't have a choice about the kind of environments that occupying staff, of course, do have to a sort of more of an extent, but I think it's particularly important in these environments. And I've been drawing on the work that I've been doing over the last few years on research in other settings like hospitals and schools, and looking in quite a bit of depth at the research which is coming from those environments and things that we can learn from it. Now, clearly, prisons are not hospitals and schools, and there's important differences in between them, but I think primarily some of those differences are about attitudes towards these spaces and the appetite perhaps for people to be willing to think about prisons in the same way that they might think about hospitals and schools as environments which should be enabling recovery and improvement in various ways. It's perhaps hard to persuade politicians, the public maybe, that this is how we should think about prisons, but I think most of us on this call would like to think about them in this way. We know from research in hospitals and schools that certain things are good for us. They encourage well-being, and as Simon was saying at the beginning of this seminar, they have been demonstrated to improve outcomes, both in terms of clinical recovery, lowered stress, better educational outcomes and so on. I'm just going to talk through a bit in some of this talk what some of those findings are and the ways in which they might apply to prisons. So I'm going to be thinking then about how space matters and trying to pull out some sort of take-home things that we might practically do in prison environments to encourage those better well-being outcomes. So the first one of these things is noise. Right? You all know much better than I do that prisons are very noisy places. One of the reasons for this is they have lots of hard, shiny surfaces off which noises bounce. So they're already quite bad places for controlling noise. And prisons tend to be built, let's say, not in the most expensive way that they might be. So the kind of noise control measures that we might find in more expensive buildings, and especially if you've ever been into a prison that's been converted into a hotel, it doesn't sound the same. There's been treatments applied to the walls and floors to stop the noise from bouncing around. Not only that though, but prisons have a lot of noise in them. They are places where there's bleeps, buzzes, bangs, shouts, clangs, clatters and so on going on all the time. So there's a lot of noise being created in them, and it bounces around in those spaces. Now, this is not just an annoying thing. Noise is actually quite bad for our mental state. So even though we might understand consciously that not every bleep and buzzer is something that we should be scared of or alarmed by. It puts our mind into a kind of fight or flight mode. And when we're in that mode, even if we might consciously understand that it's not something to be scared of, it's quite hard for the mind to focus, reflect, relax, and engage productively with the kind of things that we might want to do. Light and dark are also key. So anyone who's got a young child or who's spent many nights not sleeping well knows that they're not a good person at the end of that. We have a shorter fuse, it's more difficult to act reasonably when we haven't slept well. We know that good sleep is connected to good outcomes. And we know also that many people who are incarcerated and have alcohol and drug problems already have disrupted circadian rhythms. So for them, it's particularly important to be able to maintain good light in the daytime and good dark at night. So there's all sorts of things that we can potentially do in prisons to improve this. So the things that we could change then around these environments, firstly, given that in prisons it's going to be quite hard to change the actual fabric of the environment, we can't invest in panels for controlling noise and so on. This is perhaps for new builds, but we can think about the control of the amount of noise which is created in those environments. So thinking about what radios sound like, use of keys, has every door got to be slammed all the time and so on. So thinking about how we can control that noise, because in an incredibly noisy environment, you have to shout, and as soon as you start to shout, then it gets worse and worse and worse. And it's really hard to have productive, good, non-shouting conversations in those environments, which might lead to the kind of interactions that we think are good. It's important to maintain good natural daylight, and a really straightforward thing here is to keep windows clean, to let as much of that light in as we can, and also to enable access to that light in the outdoors. But good dark at night is just as important, and here's where I think I've seen the most potential for change, ensuring that there's the potential for people to control the amount of light which is coming into cells through windows at night, and also thinking about how much light is minimally needed at night for security. Simon mentioned some of the work that I've done in particular prison spaces, and visiting rooms are a key one here. So these are really often noisy, they're crowded, again they have shiny walls and floors quite often. They're not potentially the best sound environment for the kind of conversations that we hope that people might be able to have productively about the future of their interpersonal relationships, the welfare of their children and so on. I've spoken to many people incarcerated who talk about things they want to talk about during visits, but because the room is so noisy and because of the way in which it's laid out, they don't want to shout about that stuff because they know that that conversation can then be overheard. So those conversations don't take place. So that means that those key topics about the future of relationships and children and so on get delayed until, some future date in which that conversation can happen, and perhaps by then it's too late. So some quite small, banal, perhaps, things about how visits, tables and chairs are spaced can make quite a big difference here. So I always advise that people on visits should be closer to the person they've come to see than to somebody else's visit, and I'm often surprised at how often that's not the case. And when I've had the opportunity to advise prisons on what their visit spaces should be like, it's quite often informative to think about other spaces on the outside which do the kind of thing that we want visits rooms to do. So here's an example of a room in a prison in Nieuwegein in the Netherlands, where they asked me to come in and advise them on what their room should be like. I don't have the pre-picture here, but let me tell you, it was the worst thing I've ever seen as a visits room. And we talked there about different kinds of seating, making the space feel normal. And I said to them, you know, think about this kind of thing on the out, Starbucks, Costa and so on. What does it look like there? How can we recreate this kind of environment? And as you can perhaps see, they went to IKEA, got themselves some stuff, repainted, changed the lights, and it made an enormous difference to how that space worked, and they had great results from that. Now, that's not a thing that we all can do in all cases, but I think it's important to see the kind of thing that they were aiming for there. Simon's talked a bit about the research that I've done on nature contact and how important I think that is in prison. And I just want to share with you some quotes from research that I've completed over the last few years with people incarcerated in the UK talking about how they feel about having lost contact with nature while they've been incarcerated. And it's quite sort of banal, again, things that we might not think are that important. You know, is it important to remember what it feels like to lie on grass and smell it and feel it? Perhaps we might think not, but they definitely think that it is, and that having lost the memory of what this sensory experience is like is a bad thing and is felt as a detriment. When people have experience and have access to green spaces whilst incarcerated, they do find a benefit from this, and they talk quite extensively about the difference that having those green spaces there makes compared to concrete, compared to the kind of austere environments that Simon was very unfortunately saying that he had at Birmingham. They are still there, Simon, I have to say. And the ways in which access to green spaces to some extent allow people to momentarily imagine a life beyond prison and momentarily have a sense of an improved well-being, more calmness and so on. This is not just about real green spaces. This effect can also be had through immersive imagery. And I'm sure that lots of you on the call know exactly where this is in the image, but this is some quotes from some research that I was doing at that establishment where someone's talking about the impact that these kind of whole wall natural environment pictures had. And again, it's not just, oh, that looks nice. It's about the wind flapping my jacket, being able to hear my dog barking, smell the fresh air, feeling the grass on my feet again, and so on. And a sense in which this picture enables them to sort of momentarily vanish into it, explore what a version of life on the outside might be, and just sort of have something to focus on, and in the quote on the right, to structure a conversation about that isn't the ordinary prison politics. It's something different. It's a visual stimulus that enables a different state of being. And Simon was also talking about some recent research that I've been doing on this topic, and that was really triggered by many conversations in prisons in the UK and elsewhere, where, you know, I was told this is great, all this sort of qualitative data which talks about how people say that they feel, but how do you know what kind of difference this makes? You know, can we prove that there is a relationship between green space and well-being of various kinds? So having been set that challenge, I put together a team of colleagues, and we came up with a way to measure how green prisons are, which was using GIS methods and ordnance survey data to calculate the green space percentage within the wall or fence of all closed establishments in England and Wales. And we correlated that green space percentage with published data for self-harm, violence between prisoners, violence towards staff, and prison staff sickness, absence. And we found that green space controlled for self-harm, violence and staff sickness absence, in that levels of all three were lower in prisons which had more green space, and this effect was robust when we controlled for prison category, size, population, crowding, age, being purpose-built or not, and so on. So everything that we could think of, which was a characteristic of those prisons, we included in that data, and found that still green space was key. So I think this is not a particularly surprising finding right. This is what we thought that we'd find, but it was a much stronger relationship than we had thought that it would be. So what can we do in that arena? What things might we change? I would say, based on that research, that we should be introducing green views wherever we can, which means grass, shrubs, and especially trees. And I think, you know, a nice thing to perhaps think about is to target having a green view from every cell. Can we do this? Is it feasible? I think it's also an idea to try to enable access to green spaces, so to actually be in them, not just to walk through or pass by them, but to enable walking on grass and the smell of grass and so on, and that different kind of connection. And I appreciate that many prison sites don't have the scope to do this. You know, you are limited by how much space there is. So it's also important to note that the kind of immersive imagery, such as you have there in the picture that's in the reception area at Liverpool, is also important too, and can have a positive effect. It's worth saying, I think, that all of this green space stuff not only supports prisoner and staff well-being, but it also, of course, furthers the sustainability policies which the prison service has, and they are key as well. I'm going to stop there because I'm sure that you want to hear from your colleagues about things which they've been doing, but if you'd like to ask any questions, please do it in the chat, or if you'd like to get in touch directly afterwards, I'd love that too. Thanks a lot.
Thank you ever so much, Dominic. Again, some really absolutely fascinating observations and some really interesting points, and I'm sure we'll get a lot of questions. As Dominic has said, if people would like to add to the chat, please do so, and we will come back to those questions in due course. I'm delighted now to hand over to a series of operational colleagues who are just going to give some little insights about some of the very practical things that they have sought to do to change the environments in which they operate. We're delighted to have Dave Nicholson, Ralph Lebusky and Ruth Stevens, who are respectively the governors for Warren Hill, Hewell and Whitemoor. And I believe, Dave, you're going to go first. So I think there are some slides to go with it, but if I can hand over to you, Dave, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Simon. Hope you can hear me. So I'm Dave Nicholson. I've been great pleasure in governing HMP Warren Hill for the last 2.5 years. I've been asked to give this short presentation this afternoon. So whilst I'm talking, you can see some of the environment that we work in. So for those who don't know Warren Hill, we're a small Category C training establishment holding adult men within a progression regime. We have a therapeutic community, and we also have a psychologically informed planned environment. We offer a bespoke service to a population which is mainly made up of IPP and life sentence residents, who for the most are over tariff. So we're a fully integrated site where the offence is not a barrier to participating in the regime. And the last HMIP visit in 2019 stated that we do hold some of the most serious offenders in a prison, with a number of residents with complex issues. But using the 3 regimes, we've strived to evidence risk reduction, and hopefully we prepare our residents for their parole hearings. So we set out our vision mainly around conditions of success, to establish an environment where that enables everybody to peacefully sort of reside and respect each other no matter what. Hopefully we maintain our open channels of communication and participating constructively in our regime, and that hopefully will then strive to our conditions of success. So our enabling environment is based around positivity and reform, where we see punishment is a balance between care, trust, fairness and respect, and also to encourage a tangible rehabilitative culture. So our experience over time clearly links the environment, if projected in a positive manner, which is clean, decent and structured, provides a real sense of pride and ownership whilst allowing innovation and creativity. This does affect the culture of the prison, and it allows our community to become more progressive, and gives hope to people who for a long time have been stuck in a system where many have exceeded their tariff dates. So when we talk about culture, it's not just about, in Warren Hill, it's not just about how the prison looks, although that's a really important factor, it's also about how it feels. The relationships is key to that positive culture. Being supportive and having an effective key working system between staff and our residents really helps. This does not mean we shy away from having those difficult conversations and challenging conversations just to appease people. As well as improving our environment, being procedurally just is just as important, and how you deliver that message to gain the greatest impact on that individual. So allowing for those people to have a voice and being listened to, being able to, being open, being transparent, being understanding, and explaining why decisions are being made. By demonstrating that respect and being courteous, these will gain the trust of the community and allows for the culture to grow. So having a positive culture also affects, we found the behaviours that are being displayed, not just by residents, but our staff as well. So when I talk about residents, so our senior leadership team had a long discussion around terminology and what we would use moving forward following some media interest. This created a really passionate debate around this, especially around on the back of losing so much ground over the pandemic and the loss of momentum with our relationships. And we know that they dipped over the last 19 months. So we felt that reverting back to calling people in our prison prisoners, and some of our community really wanted that as well, we would lose that ethos and culture that we built up over the years. So internally, we still refer to our population as residents to maintain our culture. Behaviours demonstrated by having a good environment and a culture makes the prison a safe, decent place to live and work. This prison is a safe prison to the point in 2019 we closed our segregation unit, and there was no need to have one. We have minimal assaults, our violence is extremely low, we don't have bullying, and our self-harm is also extremely low. So we've created an environment which is zero tolerance to violence, which was wholly supported and expected by our resident council and our community. Men who come here can be themselves, and it normally takes them about 3 months to actually bed into our regime that we have. They don't have to be the person or the reputation that follows them in previous establishments or in fact in the community. They can be themselves, and the culture and the environment allows them to concentrate on them and their progression and their journey. We also went on a journey as well. When I first came here, we were going through the Enabling Environment accreditation, and this is a journey was long and very hard. Our TC and Pipe are well used and versed to the enabling environment standards, but we wanted the whole prison to reap the benefits of which will underpin what we do. So we achieved that accreditation in November 2019 for the whole prison, and we have a yearly assessment which we get assessed and passed. But these standards have now become business as usual. So our regime, we built our regime around reflecting the principles of normality, and we tried to do as much as possible to mirror what we do in the outside world, and this helps our population to try and adjust and return to the community in a supportive manner. So this is now our focus. So we've been successful in supporting IPP men in their parole and outcomes, but what we're seeing increasingly is a increase in our recall rates. Again, linking in with our environment and our ambition to reduce that recall rate, we just opened up a 4-bed unit to mimic approved premise conditions, which our population can get used to independent living, reporting instructions and building trust. So I know it was a short presentation, but just to sum up, I think if you create a positive environment, it impacts on the culture, which in turn then reflects on the behaviours of our residents and our staff, and the prison becomes a more progressive and safe place to be. Okay, so I'm just going to hand over to Ralph at Huel.
Hello everybody, Ralph Lubkowski, Governor at Huel. I'm going to talk today and provide some examples and pictures, the ones that I've managed to get, from a number of prisons that I've worked at recently. You'll see some pictures on there which are mostly Stafford, but I'm going to start off just reflecting on a point that Dominic made around visits and the importance of the visit space, with a reflection on Leicester, where I was Deputy Governor about 4 years ago now. And we actually ran a project alongside De Montfort University with their interior design team to create a space that was far more fitting for visits. Leicester had a traditional row upon row of bolted down furniture. It was a truly revolting environment. It smelled, the carpets were disgusting. It was appalling, to be honest. So we ripped all that out with some safety money that we'd acquired, because that was probably the best use we could find for it, and actually created, based on a model almost like a coffee shop, a design designed by a student. The design was called A Changing Space for Changing Lives, and it was all non-fixed furniture, not pineapple furniture. It was different to that, non-fixed furniture, and it completely changed, to some extent changed the whole prison, actually, because it showed not only that we were investing in families and in prisoners, it also was an investment in staff, because the fact that it was a changing space for changing lives allowed us to use and move the furniture. We could hold events, we could hold concerts, we could utilise creative arts in a space that previously we didn't have. So, and let anybody that knows Leicester knows it's a tiny footprint. There's virtually nothing you can do with that site. It's very challenging to do much, but that was one example of where you can take an opportunity and actually do something really positive in what is a very difficult environment in terms of certainly green spaces and space in total. So that's just one reflection of something that I've done in a prison, and we've done in a prison where, which links to the work that Dominic was talking about. I wanted to focus again on two different prisons, very different prisons, the last two I've governed, which is Stafford and Hull. So starting with Stafford. Stafford's an old, not even Victorian, it's Georgian actually. So it's not even a Victorian red brick, it's much older than that. Anybody that knows Stafford knows it holds men convicted of sexual offences. So a very specific type of population, minimal violence, self-harm or substance misuse, but a real issue around identity and self-worth and shame and guilt issues based to the offending behaviour of a lot of the men in there in many instances. So a real sense of despair, actually, because obviously many of them have lost identities, families, communities, a really difficult space. So at Stafford, we decided that we wanted, I talked very early about softening the edges, again, reflecting on something Dominic said. So how do we soften the edges of what is a very old, in many ways beautiful, but very institutional space? And so you can see some examples here around use of green space. I was fortunate enough to inherit some beautiful gardens, which was great, but we decided to, the space you can see there with the goats was actually the regional dogs team, who for some reason were based in the prison, had the least need of regional dogs of any prison in the West Midlands. So we sort of evicted the regional dogs team and turned that into what we called the paddock, which was a space for our goats and chickens. The impact of the goats was massive. The staff used to take them for walks around the prison. We used them in family visits, and prisoners used to go down there to conduct act reviews. And when we started key working as part of offender management in custody, staff also used to go down there to do key worker sessions, particularly with prisoners who were feeling vulnerable and stressed and anxious. The furniture you can see there was all recycled in the site by prisoners in that site. They created all of that from scraps. Also a sense of pride and identity. So you can see there the Stafford knot. Anybody that knows Stafford Prison will know that the Stafford knot is everywhere. And again, there's a real sense of identity, and there was a sense of pride in working in an old prison like Stafford. The staff really identified with that environment. So utilising that and linking the sense of pride that the staff had in with the environment into the green spaces was something that had already been done, and we continue to try and do that. We also used a lot of creative arts. I don't know whether we've got a slide with any of the artwork from Stafford on it, but we certainly used a lot of creative art. So building on that idea of what's the view from the cell. A lot of the views from the cell at Stafford were, yeah, here we go, perfect, seamless, thank you. Were very much austere red brick barbed wire, even though it was actually a very safe and progressive environment. So how do you, again, soften the edges? Use of murals, again, working in partnership with outside organisations, all virtually nil cost. You know, this didn't cost a lot of money. The exception being the room there you can see with the new furniture in it, but again, still relatively small investment for a big outcome. And you can see there some of the artwork produced by the prisoners. Installation of fish tanks onto wings had a huge difference. Prisoners just being able to watch the fish swim, and actually some prisoners then taking ownership of looking after the fish. So again, agency, ownership, sense of identity and value, which as I mentioned was key at Stafford. So it showed the guys at Stafford that we were investing in them, that there was hope, there was a future. This was a space where they could reflect and come to terms with what they had done and what the rest of their life was going to look like, which links on to the Huel experience, which is Huel. My focus in the last sort of 16 months has been around well-being. Well-being is a driver of safety. So individualised, personal focus on well-being to understand what are the actual needs of the men that we have. What's going on behind the behaviours? How do we understand that and actually try and get to grips with it, rather than just consistently treating the symptoms of the issue, i.e. the violence, the self-harm, which we know doesn't work in effect, or is very reactive and is difficult to get underneath that and understand what do we need to do. So we're focusing on this sort of concept of well-being. Of course, environment is critical to that. So I talk about a holistic approach to well-being, which is understanding that all of the different pieces of somebody's well-being have to be in place in order for us to create change in people for whom change is incredibly difficult, particularly in a category B local prison, which Huel is. Huel is also one of the 6 prisons that's identified as a performance issue and requiring of additional support. So they're very difficult past decade or so. So we've started to try and demonstrate in a similar way to Stafford, but with different techniques. And you can see one of the projects there. These artwork were actually designed by men as part of a competition we ran. They're then painted by the men. So we take a panel out, we paint the panel and put the panel back in. And these are on the main walkways. Movement to labour at Huel used to be a truly horrific experience, and it was extremely challenging. And we decided, well, how do we change that? It's a very institutional space, very austere, very stark. So actually, let's give the men some agency to design that themselves. So these are their designs, nothing to do with us. Well, I have designed one, but nobody's painted it yet. And it's just changed. The colours are different. They're like stained glass, and the light's different that comes into that space. So instead of it feeling austere and brutalistic, which it has done, all of a sudden it just feels like somebody cares and there's an investment in that experience. Of course, for the staff as well who use those walkways all the time, again, they feel invested in and they feel a sense that there is a purpose at that prison, and it's a prison that cares about the well-being of the people that are there, even in small touches like painting some windows. We will be introducing goats and chickens at Huel as well. One initiative in our Oak unit, which is our unit for the most vulnerable men in our care, which we've just opened recently as part of our targeted care pathways and steps to wellbeing project, is that we are completely refurbished it, different colours in every cell, all colours designed to be therapeutic and conducive to healing. But particularly, we have an aviary in what used to be the exercise yard, a small garden, and we've just installed a polytunnel so that the men can actually garden and create produce. And we've done the same for the staff as well. So we were fortunate enough to get funding for a number of polytunnels that we've squeezed into every space we've got. And the idea with them is that prisoners will use them, but also that the staff will have a polytunnel where they can go at lunchtime, have a small space, their own little allotment where they can grow things, because we know that that will help, particularly on a stressful, difficult day, of which there will be plenty working in a prison. So it's a very short summary of what we're doing, but environment will be critical. We talk about the Oak unit as being as the environment is the intervention. So the Oak unit doesn't have a lot of formal interventions. It's not an accredited programme. It's not a PIPE. It's not a TC. It's just an environment with staff that are wanting to look after people's well-being, and the environment itself becomes the intervention. because it's designed specifically to support really vulnerable men. And we are very confident and hopeful, and the early signs are it's having a real impact. And we're looking at how do we learn from that? How do we learn from our wellbeing unit and run that out across the prison? And what we're seeing is some of those really difficult outcomes that are so hard to achieve, particularly in a local prison, such as violence and self-harm. We're seeing them reduce at a pretty quick rate. So we're hoping that continues, and we know that this sort of work will be key to carrying on that journey. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ralph. And I think we're going to hand over to Ruth.
Yes, thanks, Simon, and apologies to everybody. I haven't prepared a PowerPoint presentation, but I just wanted to spend a few minutes giving you a bit of an idea of what we've been trying to do at Whitemoor. In terms of background, you've heard a little bit about various academic studies that have taken place at Whitemoor. The prison was built in 1992. It's very modern. It was purpose-built as a dispersal prison where we mix really dangerous Category A men amongst a very heavily sentenced Cat B population. So the vast majority of the people who live at Whitemoor will be in prison for 3 decades or more. And so for me, how you settle that population into such heavily weighted sentences, how you do that in a way where they have some hope, some ambition, and some sense of well-being was our priority. When I took over as governor in 2019, the outgoing governor, Will Stiles, had already started a project to improve the decoration inside the prison. You can get to almost any part of Whitemoor by walking along a single covered corridor. It's enclosed in breeze blocks. You don't even see the outdoors from the start of the day to the end of the day. So he invested in a painting programme. I want you to imagine for a moment the brightest, most eye-blistering yellow you can imagine. Amplify that by 100 and you're getting close to the actual shade of yellow we've painted the prison in. The local manufacturer of the paint has produced that much of it now. They have officially changed its tone to Whitemoor yellow, which is quite a legacy, I must say. What we did is then we invested in some of the images that you saw in Dominique's presentation, some of the whole wall images of nature, of wildlife, and that made a very, very quick, it wasn't expensive. We used the same company that Warren Hill used, thanks to Dave. We came in and stole that idea. And it made a massive impact very quickly. We found ourselves having conversations with the men about where is that? I really want to know about that area. You know, it's interesting to me. So for other establishments that are thinking about doing a similar project, I'd encourage you to do that homework first, because that caught us out actually. My desire then when I came in as governor was to build on that start that Will had undertaken. And I wanted to do that for several reasons. Number one was my vision for Whitemoor is that we will help everybody that lives or works here become a better version of themselves. And you've already heard all of the reasons why that's a good thing and how it impacts on safety, but also on hope for the men that live here. Anybody that's had the privilege of hearing Terry Waite speak about his years of imprisonment will be familiar with the story he tells about having been imprisoned in an underground cave for many, many years, where he only saw daylight once a day in the morning. And one day he stood on top of a toilet cistern and looked down into the street and saw a lady walking by carrying a bunch of flowers, and the impact that had on him in terms of his hope and his ability to carry on really resonated with me. Whitemoor has got quite a lot of green space within the prison, but almost none of it is accessible to the men who live here. Most of them spend their times completely indoors, except for an hour a day where they walk around a concrete box attached to their wing. So what we did is set about installing a range of gardens. We've been working with a local charity, a Suffolk-based charity called Greener Growth, who've developed a format for installing gardens which are manufactured out of sleepers, so they're raised beds predominantly. The gardens every garden includes a range of trees. Some of the trees yield fruit, there are flowers, there's a pond in each garden, a small polytunnel, and more importantly, each garden has a raised bed, which is just a large grass bed. And the idea of that is that staff, key workers, or clinicians and therapists can actually go out and access that space, and the men can sit in a patch of grass and actually have a conversation in a much less structured way than we tend to do across an interview table. So my commitment at Whitemoor, we've committed over the next 3 to 4 years that each year we will expand our gardening projects. So we have a maintenance commitment with Greener Growth, and in addition to that, by the end of 2022, every residential area within the prison will have access to one of these gardens that we've installed, which is a massive improvement. It started out in one of our therapeutic spaces. So we've got one unit we run in partnership with the NHS for people with diagnosed personality disorders. And that's where our first garden went, and it yielded such a huge impact on the residents of the unit and the staff that we said, actually, we need to do more of this. We have committed to a sustainability project. Some of that initiative was because, you know, we're just fabulous people and we want to do the responsible thing. But also, when I saw my first electricity bill as governor, that was quite a motivation to me. So we've got a solar panel which is part installed. By the end of this financial year, that will be completed. We've started a recycling project that we wanted the men here to be able to feel that they were contributing to. So we've started small, actually. Our local waste is only ever collected as one big lump, so recycling waste wasn't something that was on the cards, but we've introduced battery recycling and printer cartridge recycling, things like that. And those boxes are in all prisoner areas. In addition to that, we have the benefit at Whitemoor, as part of our land is a 75-acre nature reserve that surrounds about 2/3 of the prison. That for us has given us 2 opportunities. Opportunity number 1 was that actually looking after that space first has helped us then create habitats inside the prison that surround each of the residential units. So we've now got, as well as the views of the trees and the flowers and things like that, we've got wildlife that's coming into the prison, and we've introduced features around the units that attract each of those species. I'm very proud to say that we have a birdman and a batman. So that's been something that the residents have enjoyed seeing. The nature reserve as well has also been incredibly popular with staff. So we've got some rare breeds which have been detected out there. We also discovered in the local area there is a huge level of support for the armed forces, and the local remembrance parade is the largest in Cambridgeshire. And that gave us an opportunity, a bit like Ralph was saying earlier, to tap into something that staff feel very passionate about. So what we did was, through some research, we discovered that during World War II, there was actually a plane crash on our land, on what is now our land. So we found out the information about the men who perished in the plane crash, and we have built a memorial at the back. And just a few weeks ago, we held our official dedication to the war memorial with the RAF, and staff and the local community actually have really appreciated that. If you've got any spaces in your prisons or around your prisons where you could potentially do some work like we've achieved in our nature reserve, I'd encourage you to engage with the Modge ecology team. We did that, who supported us in coming in and doing some studies, and it was through those studies that we were able to receive special scientific interest status for our nature reserve, which means that it's been protected now. So that is a space that will remain for Whitemoor. We have got a new project called Seeding Hope, which we are also just starting to introduce. The idea is that the people that come to Whitemoor, the opportunities they will have to do really creative things are limited by comparison to other establishments. But the concept of doing what we can when we can is something that we're really trying to drive forwards. So Seeding Hope will see men doing some horticultural and research around the improvements to their lifestyle that come with working with nature. They will bring on some small seeds into small trees. The idea is then we will be the flagship site. Those trees will then progress to other prisons in the wider part of the estate, which is quite metaphorical, and it feels a bit like the journey a prisoner would expect to go through themselves. We've been able to do, during COVID, we've been able to do a literature review on the qualitative benefits of engaging in work with nature, and we've started doing some communication with our residents about that. In addition to that, we've been able to explore with them how the investment in the orchard we've got within the nature reserve, for example, in a decade, well, it's about 8 years now, when each of those trees matures, each tree will yield a ton of fruit, which will come into the prison and keep contributing to the healthy lifestyles of the men who live here. So there's lots of progress that we're making. We've been really creative in doing what we can, where we can, and maximising the spaces available to us, even if that means that it isn't actually going out into the large green spaces within the prison. And our aim is that that development will continue to drive home the message that whereas a lot of our population are not yet ready to do in-depth work on their offence-based learning, what we can do is start at the very start of their sentence, exploring with them that if they make better choices, they get better outcomes. So our drive towards working with nature is a huge part of that.
Ruth, that's been tremendously helpful. I'm sorry to jump in. I know we've got a couple of other speakers we need to bring in as well. Hopefully, if you're able to stay for the panel, I think there's probably going to be quite a lot of interesting questions, because I think what you've demonstrated is actually you're able to really take some of the most challenging environments and actually still really think very creatively about what you're doing. So it's absolutely fascinating to hear, and I'm sorry to jump in. And I'm sure we'll be very keen to hear a bit more from you in the panel session, if that's all right. Thank you, Ruth. I'm going to hand over very briefly before we do go to the panel to Michelle Babert from Greener on the Outside, and also to Sarah Harrison from the MOJ sustainability team, who again I think are going to pick up on some of the really obvious, I was going to say golden thread, but I think it probably should be a green thread that we've had that's been running through quite a lot of the inputs thus far. So I think, Michelle, are you going first?
Michelle, are you on mute? Oh my goodness, thank you. Okay, so I haven't prepared a presentation, a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to keep with that one slide. But thank you so much for this invitation. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to be here today and talk about a part of my job, which is facilitating a programme called Greener on the Outside for Prisons, which is quite a long-standing programme and has been firmly sort of embedded across the 11 public sector prisons in the Northwest. I think there's been some absolutely fascinating presentations so far, and hopefully this presentation will just pick up some aspects of that, and we can use the Q&A to develop that further, maybe in the context of the work I do. So I'm just going to tell you, I'm just going to set out what Greener on the Outside as a programme is, outline how we know it works, what works about it, and hopefully have the opportunity to give you some good practice in a very short window. I think the big thing that I've picked up, as I'm sure you all have, is the importance of people's connections with the environment. And for me, Greener on the Outside is very much a programme about people, place, space, planet. So people, place and planet particularly, but I was really interested in Dominique's talk around how space is used in the context of how I was looking at it for what we affectionately call Goop, rather than the full title of Greener on the Outside. So Goop is essentially a nature-based health programme that takes a systems approach, working across the whole prison system and beyond, kind of into the community. So in this sense, it's very much more than working solely with the gardens department. It's very much about how we join up across all departments. What's the role of the health provider in the prison? What's the role of education? How do we connect with catering, residential, and through the gate? And for me as well, I know there's some questions coming up in the chat, but for me as well, I work very closely with the sustainability team, Anna in ecology and PSPI, to make sure that some of the projects that are being rolled out nationally can be, well, fit within the work that we're doing in the prisons in the Northwest, and make sure that there's communication between us. So I think the key message is perhaps that Goop is not a single intervention. If we're taking a whole prison approach or a whole system approach, it becomes much more complex than that. And it's in taking an ecological approach to health, it's about how in the prison system we can embed what we do so that we've got sustainable systems and interventions in that way. In involving different parts of the prison and everybody having different roles, and not just focusing purely on kind of health outcomes in a way, we're able to look at more creative ways of engaging people with their health. So education, for example, getting them involved, getting the education provider involved, and being able to kind of learn by doing and take key skills, for example, outside. I think again it was something Dominique was talking about, how we use space and take things outside. So that's a key part of Goop. You know, if we did maths outside, we can measure things, we can fill things, we can do right angles with laying flags and so on. So taking learning outside of the classroom and doing things outside is key. So it works best as a joined up system, but there are projects within it. So how do we know it works? How do we know that working across the whole system, focusing on health and using the environment works? We've done several evaluations. We embed monitoring within all the projects and all the prisons, which look at self-perceived changes in health, in behaviour. We've integrated observational work, produced case studies. We look at the perspectives of prisoners and staff. We're looking to do some work in terms of gathering data with families as well. More creative methods, using photography, getting out and for participants to be able to photograph that journey of change as well. We've had some PhD studies, so lots of different types of data that we've collected, and going into 2022 we are hoping to do a lot more of that not post-COVID, but you know what I mean. We also look at how we can embed qualifications into the overall prison programs, and yeah, no, I'll leave it there. Some of the feedback that we've had speaks to what other presenters have said in terms of things that you wouldn't straight away associate with health outcomes. So we talk about mental health and mental well-being, for example. Sleep is something that came up earlier, and one of the big things that comes out over and over again is how participants sleep better if they're engaged with their environment. They can manage the prison environment better. They have improved relationships with staff and other prisoners, for example. Our evaluations have shown reductions in self-harm, reductions in violence and aggression, improvements in self-reported well-being, confidence, self-esteem, willingness to learn, that thing of coming out of your room and being able to engage with other people, engage with education, engage with their own health issues. And early on in the programme, other unexpected and unanticipated outcomes were things like a reduction in smoking, and that was because people were busy, people were engaged in other activities that distracted them. So just in terms of examples, I mean, I've seen some fabulous examples today of really good practice, and I'd love to be able to spend some time talking about all the fabulous projects that I've been involved in seeing develop in the Northwest, but we'll save that. We've got an event coming up next year, and hopefully a lot of people that are on this call will be able to join us for that. One of the big things has been about the Goop network, so we bring all the prisons together, and I think this really is good practice in a way to reduce competition. We know there's lots of competition between prisons, and I think in some ways that's really good. But we bring people together on site and we share what people are doing in a walk and talk. I was really pleased to hear Simon say about almost the kind of the refocus and emphasis on creativity and arts back into prison, because the Goop network very much draws on creative methods to be able to help practitioners in prison talk about what they do and to do things differently, to work with the environment, work with what you've got, and to do things differently. So we bring everyone together and we do business as a walk and talk. We walk on site and we learn, and the national team come and they're part of that, and they can bring the resources and the thinking in that sense. So I think that's a really good piece of good practice, that we network the 11 prisons together in that sense. There's, as has been presented today, we've got examples of changing environments, those concrete environments into green space, being able to look out of your room and to see green space, to paint green space and murals and so on onto wings. So we got lots of evidence and good practice around those examples as well. So I don't know whether there's very much else to say, but I think Ralph summed it up really neatly and said the environment is the intervention, and I think that's very much the approach that Goop takes. But I'd welcome some questions as well in the chat, maybe.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Michelle. Again, I think, as with all of our speakers, and that's probably a theme we might return to, we could have spent the 2 hours just unpacking one theme, but I think we were really keen to try and get people to really understand the span of this topic as a kind of first conversation, deliberately really to help people see those linkages. Thank you so much for joining us. I think, Sarah, if you're around, we're just going to very quickly wrap up and then open for questions. But Sarah, I wonder if you could just, we've had lots of references to sustainability, and I wondered if you just wanted to mention briefly some of the work that you're doing in MOJ.
Of course. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Sarah Harrison. I'm the Head of Embedding Sustainability for MOJ and HMPPS. For those that don't know, MOJ and HMPPS have one kind of cross-cutting sustainability team. He's headed up by the Sustainability Director, Carl von Reibnitz. And we work really closely with Simon's team and with Michelle, who's also on in kind of prison industries. We are a growing team, and that's to kind of reflect the increasing importance of sustainability issues. So if you were unaware of us before, hopefully over the coming months you will become more and more aware of us as we get some more people in post and we kind of raise the profile of the issues that we're dealing with. It sounds like a lot of work is already going on in prisons. So to some extent, it's just a question of kind of finding out what people are doing, sharing best practice, that kind of thing. In terms of the sorts of work that the central sustainability team are doing that you might see on the ground, so installation of solar panels and charge points across the estate, creation and in some cases re-establishment of ponds and orchards in every prison. So there's a couple of projects there that the ecology team are working on. We're setting up 7 tree nurseries. We managed to get hold of some money from DEFRA. So there's 7 tree nurseries. They're hoping to plant 100,000 trees per year, and they will be used on our estate. I've seen in the chat mention of the Queen's Green Canopy project. So this is for the Queen's Jubilee next year. The idea is that public sector charities and other organisations like that plant some trees. So we're hoping to get involved in that. And then it's probably worth saying as well that we do spend a lot of time working with a new prisons programme. So this is on the construction of new prisons and new builds to look at the design and the construction of these buildings to make sure they're as sustainable as possible. I just want to make a small plea because we're about to kick off some work on climate resilience on the estate. So it's a really big issue that we're starting to get a handle on now. So we will be looking at things like how can we use natural assets to kind of alleviate some of the future issues we may have with flooding and things like that. So can I just make a plea that if anybody is aware of issues already, so you know when it rains heavily, do we see instances of flooding, or when there's particularly bad storms, overheating, could you get in touch with us with some kind of anecdotal information that we have now? Because that's one of the things we're trying to do, is identify vulnerabilities across the estate. Now I know that whenever someone comes and talks about sustainability, one of the big blockers is funding. So I can't come here today and say, yes, we've got a massive pot of money to help the estate become more sustainable. We have made a bid in this year's spending review. We'll see how that goes. But we are also trying to work with the kind of maintenance budgets and things like that to make sure we use the money that we do have in a smarter way. But that doesn't mean that we aren't also looking at more innovative ways of trying to get funding and trying to fund things across the estate. So we have managed to get money from DEFRA, from BEIS, we've managed to get some trees from Atos. So, you know, please, if you've got some ideas for how we can be innovative and where we might be able to get funding from, let us know. And we will also be on the hunt across government for funding opportunities. So that was my kind of, I know that everybody wants money, I can't promise it, but we'll do our best. But what can we provide you with? So we can provide you with advice and guidance on all things sustainability. So whether it's about kind of technological solutions about heating, renewables, recycling ideas, or kind of species specific information, we have an ecology team who are really, really good. We can also help to share best practice across HMPPS. So there, as we've heard today, there are some amazing things going on across the estate. And just to plug the kind of yearly wildlife awards, which I know are really popular. It's a really great way of showcasing the information, the kind of projects that we have going on. So we really want to promote these examples, encourage others to follow. And then this year, and I'm going to be careful how I say this given what I just said on funding, but we do have a very small pot of money for micro grants. So this is kind of buying things like seeds or plants or other really low cost materials. So it's a very small pot of money, but if you needed a few £100 to do that could make us you know, a big difference to you, then please get in touch with us. We have done a one-pager that will go out after this session. It's got the SD Inquiries email address on, so you can contact us with questions, queries, information about your prison site, or just any kind of observations you want to make. So thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we'll be working with you in future.
Thank you ever so much, Sarah. And I think it's nice to genuinely have someone offering seed funding, but you're very, very welcome. I mean, thank you to all of our speakers, and also thank you to colleagues that have already been raising a number of questions in the chat. It's probably the first time I've ever found myself being so delighted to find the chat being quite so wooden, but the number of references to trees, tree planting and opportunities is quite heartwarming. Without further ado, I'd really like to kind of open up. I know we've already had some questions that have been raised in the chat, and we'll try and come back to some of those as well, but I know some of those have been touched on. Deliberately, as I've said, we've kind of chosen to try and give you lots of different perspectives so that you can really see kind of how broad this theme is, how many opportunities there are, but also the fact that we are still very much in a learning culture. I think all of our speakers today have talked about the learning curve, what we do know, what we still want to find out, what we're still looking for. So if anyone does particularly have a question, if you either want to raise your hand on the Teams, or again, we'll have a look into some of the work in the chat. One of the things that did come in, or that's the first hand coming in, I was just going to pick one from the questions that has come in, and I think actually it was to you, Dominique, but others might have a reflection as well, which was just we've talked quite a lot in very broad terms, but one of the groups that perhaps we haven't really necessarily factored in or spoken specifically about might be people with additional vulnerabilities, such as neurodiversity. And I wondered if there were any kind of reflections that any of our speakers had, perhaps starting with you, Dominique, just around how some of the environmental adaptations and the kind of relational work that we've talked about can make a difference to those with neurodivergent conditions.
Thanks, Simon. I think this is a really important question, and I gave a very brief answer to it in the chat. I think it's something that we haven't done enough research on, and partly that's because when researchers ask for ethical clearance to access prisons, it's quite difficult to get that clearance to start with, and it's especially hard if you then intend to interview or interact with especially vulnerable people. So they tend to be the ones who don't take part in that research, and therefore findings don't particularly relate to them. But I think it's a really important question because we know that people with a neurodiverse profile do interact differently with environments and do respond differently to environmental stimuli. And of course, we know that the incarcerated population does contain a very large percentage of neurodiverse people. So I think in this environment it's particularly important. The only thing that I can really offer is some broader research, which I was aware of, done by neuroscientists who are engaging with marginalised young people in general sort of urban environments, so not in prisons, and talking to people and kind of mapping their brain waves and all that clever science that they all do. And they found that for people with a particular disorder, and I'm afraid I can't recall what that was, but having then spoken to some colleagues in the prison service, it turned out that this is quite common in the incarcerated population. They found that for that group of people, contact with green space was even more beneficial than it was for people generally. So on the basis of that, I guess I would say in relation to green space, this is not, I suppose, a reason to be concerned and think about, might it be doing some harm? But the general question is definitely one that needs further work.
Thanks, Dominique. Really appreciate that. Kirk, you've had your hand up. You did get a name check earlier via Alison. I don't know if it's coming back on any of the work that Alison or other colleagues referred to, but did you want to ask a question?
Thanks, Simon. So firstly, thanks to all the speakers. It's been a fantastic sort of rich description of everything going on. I suppose just a reflection really, and then a question. For me, the one thing that seemed to connect all of the presentations really was, to some degree, they were all talking about growing things, and whether that would be around, or things particularly that need to be nurtured and cared for to create better outcomes for people. I think it's a couple of things struck me. One was that the criticality of that they only really seem to exist where the leadership have taken a conscious sort of intentional decision to make sense of connecting these things together, and really well illustrated by our leaders from the field there. There's a couple of very specific things that struck me, and then I'll sort of quickly move on to a question. But Alison mentioned, just a quote earlier, but the prison staff don't maintain order, they create it. And that was a really powerful sort of statement that sort of got me thinking about what it was that we need to grow, but also that the capacity for people to be able to open themselves up for this change was particularly fragile and needed nurturing. And then obviously sort of Dominique then went on to describe a bit more about the kind of things that supported or inhibited those things from happening, and I was left thinking about a piece of work we did with the pipes years ago about noise, and particularly the use of the tannoy system, and how all the overuse of the tannoy system, and how people were using it when they could walk 20 feet and talk to somebody face to face, and so it was sort of, it brought all that back to me really. So my question really was, I wondered from the field work both that Alice and Dominique had done, but also from the experience of our leaders in the fields, whether there was anything obvious that kind of you were seeing as a real critical first step in creating the kind of culture that we're hoping for. Really, if there's anything particularly tangible that sites were doing that enabled that kind of growth to take place, either between staff and prisoners. Anything simple, I suppose it could well be as simple as what Ruth described as a block of grass to sit on and talk, but I was just curious what you were seeing from the field.
Thanks. Alison, did you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you for that, Kirk. And all the way through this seminar, I've been trying to fuse Dominique's work with mine and think about what goes on with staff in prisons that are greening and growing trees. And Kirk probably knows that one of the things that really stood out to me at Franklin was the horticulture instructor, who was extremely good at growing people, and everybody talked about it in the prison. And he had a very particular way of sitting on a bench, letting prisoners talk, and then sort of saying, well, now should we plant a few more potatoes? And that he was a kind of model of someone who was growing things, using those same growing skills to grow the people that he was with. So I'm very interested in what goes on with staff and the establishments that are really sort of heading in this direction. There's obviously something really inspiring about prisons that become green. What's going on in the minds and hearts of staff, and does it have an impact? Does it grow them too? Or are they already there? I'd love to know more about that. And I guess my answer to what's a good first step, there are millions, but one first step was seeing staff and prisoners writing reports together, and prisoners saying, oh, I'll just go and get my key worker or personal officer and he can vouch for my transformation. That sort of ideology of staff and prisoners doing this change thing together and understanding who I am and what my risk is together, and being really kind of a team, and prisoners really perceiving that. I thought that was a total transformation from what I had normally seen and heard in other types of establishments.
Thank you, Alice. And as you say, really, really interesting. The synergies between the different presentations were really quite striking, even though the starting point, perhaps for the exam question, had been slightly different. So yes, likewise, I was thinking as everyone was talking, just how much it went back. And I think, as Kirk said as well, I think one of the really striking things has been it's not about an environment in isolation from its people. Geography talks a lot about places rather than spaces, and I think that's one of the things that's really struck me as we've been talking. It's about how you convert sometimes quite austere spaces into places. Ralph, I believe you've wanted to come in. Did you want to pick up on any of Kirk's question? Ralph, you're on mute.
Yeah, just very quickly to respond to Kurt, I think there's something about doing it with, not to. So the common thread is look for all of the opportunities where you can actually engage the community and the prisoners in the solution, and actually you don't really want it to be top down. You want it to be bottom up, preferably from the prisoners through to the staff. A really simple example, we needed a new logo at Hull, so we did a logo competition. We asked the prisoners to design a logo. And we said, make it about something that you identify Hull with, which is quite risky. And some did come back with syringes and fists, but mostly it was a lot more positive than that. And the one that won, and the common thread, was trees and birds. Hull's lucky to be surrounded by trees. And we hadn't known that. we didn't know that the prisoners identified so closely with the nature that was around them at that point. It made sense, but we didn't know. They came back with that, and our logo now actually includes a tree in it, and it's their logo. They designed it, but then also engaged the staff. So we're working on a growth project, so literally growing, and that's about understanding what the staff know will help improve their environment. My kind of ethos is to let them get on with it, because they know. So why do I need to drive that top down? Just actually hear them, and then not just hear the voice and then do a you said we did. Actually do a you said you did. So let them get on with doing it, and you tend to find that they will. And half the stuff that happens now, I don't even know what it is, which I think is pretty good. So they just get on with it and do it, and it's great. So that was just my reflection.
But what's really interesting, Ralph, is that is leadership. So that in itself is a form of leadership, that you've created that enabling environment. And that's something that I thought came across with what you, Ralph, with Ruth and also Dave were also saying, that actually I think you were creating conditions. I mean, without coming back too obviously to the title of the event, some of those creation of conditions are about leadership. They are about giving people the authority to kind of do things slightly differently. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting in the chat is lots of people kind of saying, well, you know, you've talked about doing it in one setting. I'm not quite sure how I might go about doing that in mine. And actually, most of you talked about starting on something quite tangible and distinct as a starting point. I'm very conscious, you know, Ruth, who I do apologise for jumping in on, but, you know, Ruth talked about some of the kind of painting exercises, but then it's been fascinating the extent to which very specific themes have been brought in. And I know one of the questions that's sort of come up in the chat has been the extent to which the men and women in prison themselves have been part of creating that environment and been involved in those conversations. And I thought that was a really strong theme that actually all of you brought in. I don't know whether Ruth or Dave, either of you wanted to come back with any further reflections just in terms of either Kirk's question or any of the subsequent inputs.
Yeah, something from our point of view, I totally agree with what Ralph said, and I was going to say all the ideas and suggestions have got to come from the ground floor, and that's residents and our staff. One other really good factor we use is our council. So we have a constitution that our council can come and hold me and my senior management team to account. They'll question things, and they'll ask to innovate and ask for ideas and suggestions, and they will go away and take those ideas and grow with them, so that their ideas, we push back to them to say, yeah, you crack on, and they develop the culture, and they develop all the initiatives and programs that and exciting things that happen within our community, and then that builds connectivity with our staff and community and our population. So when I talk about community, I talk about everybody who lives, works and offers the services here.
I think that's really important, and as you say, I think it's that entire approach. I think, you know, Alison talked at the beginning about you know, staff constitute as well as create the environment. I think that's absolutely critical, that actually the idea that disaggregating those two loses some of the importance. And I think, you know, the work that Kirk talked about in the PD programme that Alison talked about, I think, you know, the work that Michelle's talked about as well, just on Goop, you know, that holistic approach, I think, has been one of the themes that's come on really strongly. I'm conscious we've probably got time for another couple of questions, if anyone wants to kind of raise a hand on the live chat. I know there's some more in the written chat, and of course, if we don't have a chance to cover all of them, we will come back with a bit of an FAQ and come back to our speakers. But can I extend the opportunity
Simon,
again if anyone would like to raise a question?
Sorry,
Yeah,
Simon,
Ruth.
can I just,
Yeah, do you want to come back?
Yeah, so I had pretty much finished talking anyway, so I must let you off the hook. You hadn't interrupted me. I was winding up anyway. But
Thank
I just
you.
wanted to be really honest, actually, about the challenges that we still face in response to a question that Alison posed in the chat about whether we are building staff as well and which comes first. And I definitely think staff are up for it. But I think if I was being really honest, I think all prisons I think, but definitely for Whitemoor, particularly with events that have surrounded Whitemoor over the last kind of 18 months to 2 years. I'm not sure all staff fully understand how their role is defined. I think they're still struggling in the space between I am here as a disciplinarian and I am here as a caregiver. And that's something that we are acutely aware of as part of our wellbeing and recovery strategy. And I definitely want to capitalise on a lot of the research that's going around at the moment. You know, people valued so much being able to get out onto our nature reserve during their lunch break whilst the whole country was in lockdown. That had such a profoundly positive impact. So it's definitely an opportunity for us to exploit, feels like an unkind word, but capitalise and try to get the answer to that question going in the right direction, actually. And actually we are caregivers, we are rule setters, but we are also caregivers. But there's work still to be done, I think, because of what all prisons have been through.
And Ruth, thank you, because that touched on a question I think that's come up quite a lot in the chat as a theme. And I think, again, a really important element that and you know, Dave's just talked about it as well from his work at Warren Hill, in that, you know, these are environments for our staff as well, and for partners who spend a very large proportion of their time in these. So often people think of prisons and they kind of might have a view that these should be austere environments because of some notion of punishment and kind of retribution. But we also have to think what that does about the well-being of our staff that work in those settings. And I think, you know, it's very interesting when Ralph talked a little bit about the polytunnels and the fact that actually one of the considerations was giving those over, you know, one of those over to the staff. You've talked as well about the importance of creating an environment that is conducive and supportive for the well-being of staff. I think that is a really strong element, and I think it's a really important way of recognising that it is about creating an environment for all, and it will have a positive impact in terms of some of that cumulative effect that we can have by having staff feeling that the environment is there to support them in their role, as well as thinking about what it can do for others. Michelle, did you want to come back in?
I was just gonna say maybe a little bit what you've just said there, that what we found over and over again with Goop is that where you have prisoners, so we work with some quite challenging people who through Goop may become a little bit more easy to manage, more stable, and the knock-on effect of that with staff has been tremendous. You know, we've had that feedback of how, you know, that's, if you will, made their working day a little bit better, made it a bit more comfortable. So it's not, you know, there's this kind of interaction with the environment, and there's impact of that ripples kind of across it and through it. So I just wanted to add that, really. Thank you.
It's a really, really good point, and as you say, I think it's been one of the consistent themes that has come through. Thank you. Just conscious we're nearly out of time, and I'll sum up in a minute and just let people know kind of what happens next. But we might have just time for one last quick question if there's anyone wanted to particularly raise one before we wrap up. Okay, I think we've probably blown people's minds with the amount of helpful information we've given them. First of all, can I just say what a wonderful selection of inputs we've had? You know, can I particularly thank, obviously, Alison, Dominique, Dave, Ralph, Ruth, Michelle and Sarah. We deliberately set out to try and give quite a kind of view of a broad span of how we create environments. I think there's been some really strong synergies, nevertheless, between what we've heard. One of the things that really strikes me quite strongly has been almost a sense of trying to create renormalising environments. We've talked quite a lot about how institutional our settings can be, some more than others. Some lend themselves perhaps more readily to creating environments that are conducive to rehabilitation and to good well-being for staff and others. But also that element of, even where those are some really quite difficult environments and the physical environment might not necessarily lend itself, very struck by the fact that actually there are still opportunities to give control over environments in small ways and in sometimes quite modest ways that we've heard about but all of which are helping to train people again to think about living independently, which obviously is got to be absolutely critical in terms of thinking about what we're trying to achieve. And I think the fact that we also talked quite a lot about, and I think Ralph used the phrase about kind of the environment being the intervention. I think the other theme that we've seen building throughout the conversation has been, in itself, the environment is like a sort of, an additional tool and an additional resource that we can think of quite creatively and a bit differently about how it can support or hinder the work that we're trying to do. But I think critically on its own isn't likely to achieve that. We've heard a lot about the importance of strong leadership and about creating an enabling culture that allows staff and men and women in custody to think differently and to be able to exert some degree of autonomy and control over their immediate environment, which we know are some of the elements of well-being from general practice. I think very interesting talk about noise. I know there were a number of people that kind of raised questions and queries about that. I think we could probably do an entire seminar on sleep and sleep deprivation, and that might be a theme we can come from. But as I say, I think the really, really positivist thing has been, I think we've demonstrated that actually this is something that you can do relatively modestly. I know we have talked a little bit about some of the evidence and investment that's needed to support. I think what has come across really strongly are there some very simple things we can take as takeaways that you could put into practice relatively easily within even some of the most difficult environments. I also think what's come across is I think we are, in the processes of developing and creating a community of practice, not just here today, but, Michelle talked about the importance of networking. Others have done so as well. So what I think would be really interesting, we will be obviously inviting feedback on today's seminar, and I'd strongly welcome that. What have you found particularly useful? What have you, perhaps would you be interested in us exploring maybe in further events in due course? But it will be also really useful if people do want to continue to network, to use some of the conversations and contact some of our speakers today. I'm sure you'll be extremely welcome. And finally, really just wanted to say a big thank you not only to our speakers but also to the Insights team and to all those colleagues that have kind of pulled together today. I know it's a logistical challenge to have quite so many inputs from so many speakers remotely, and I'm extremely grateful to all the effort and the work they've done. You will be able to get copies of the presentation. We'll make that available shortly and today. So again, I hope if there was things you missed first time around, there'll be an opportunity to pick those up and follow up. But again, if I can just finish with actually asking if people would come off mute, and perhaps just if we could have a kind of round of applause and a thank you for all of our speakers and all our organisers today. And I'd like to wish you a very safe rest of the day and continued interest and work on this agenda. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.